BMW Motorrad BMW has always been the heavyweight that never entered the ring. They're one of the biggest motorcycle manufacturers in the world, with a reputation for engineering precision, dominance in touring and adventure bikes, and massive success in production racing. They've conquered endurance racing, carved out a powerful presence in World Superbike, and even dabbled in Formula One through their car division. But when it comes to MotoGP, the highest stage of two-wheeled motorsport, BMW has flat out refused. It's not like they haven't thought about it. In the mid-2000s, when MotoGP switched to 800cc machines, BMW engineers reportedly sketched out prototypes, toyed with engine concepts, and considered how their inline-4 architecture could be translated into a MotoGP missile. Again, in the lead-up to the 2027 regulation reset, MotoGP insiders speculated that BMW might finally take the plunge. They had the money, they had the technology, they had the desire to boost global visibility, in the same way Ducati had used MotoGP to skyrocket their brand. But every single time, BMW pulled back. Publicly, their CEO has said MotoGP is not viable. The official reasoning? The costs are astronomical, the politics are suffocating, and the technological payback is too small compared to production-based racing. Unlike Ducati, Honda, or Yamaha, BMW sees little benefit in pouring hundreds of millions into a prototype series when their bread and butter is selling GS adventure bikes and superbikes to everyday riders. Behind closed doors, there's another reason: control. BMW prefers championships where they can set the tone, shape development, and dominate. In endurance and superbike, they can push production models like the S1000RR, win trophies, and directly translate the marketing into sales. In MotoGP, the politics of Dorna, the concession system, and the constant tug-of-war with Japanese and Italian giants would leave BMW just another player in someone else's game. The refusal stings, though. Every time fans watch Ducati dominate or KTM carve out space, the question comes back: what if BMW had joined? They have the resources to run a two-bike factory team with satellite support, the engineering capacity to build prototype engines from scratch, and the global marketing to make an instant splash. Instead, BMW is the brand that teases but never delivers. They sponsor MotoGP as the official car supplier, hand out M-Series cars to pole sitters, and parade their badge at the circuits. But when it comes to actually lining up on the grid, they've refused again and again. BMW's absence has become part of MotoGP's mythology. The Bavarian giant, with the ability to reshape the sport, has stayed outside the arena, watching from the stands. For some, it's a smart business move. For others, it's the most frustrating refusal in MotoGP history. Proof that sometimes the biggest players choose comfort over combat. MV Agusta. If BMW is the giant who never entered, MV Agusta is the ghost that once ruled and then vanished. In the history books of motorcycle racing, no brand shines brighter than MV Agusta. They dominated the World Championship from the 1950s through the 1970s, winning 17 consecutive 500cc world titles and building legends out of riders like Giacomo Agostini, Mike Halewood, and Phil Red. In its prime, MV Agusta wasn't just competing, it was untouchable. Their bikes were fast, beautifully engineered, and brutally reliable. But in 1976, MV Agusta walked away. Rising costs, political tensions, and a changing motorcycle market forced them out of racing. The once untouchable team disbanded, and the factory that had produced endless champions went silent. Since then, MotoGP has been haunted by the question: why hasn't MV Agusta returned? The brand still exists. It's still Italian, still drenched in racing DNA, still producing exotic, high-priced bikes for enthusiasts. In an era where Ducati has leveraged MotoGP into global dominance, and Aprilia has clawed its way back to relevance through the Premier Class, MV Agusta's refusal to rejoin feels like betrayal. They've flirted with the idea. MV Agusta entered Moto2 with Ford Racing, building their own chassis and testing the waters of modern Grand Prix racing. But that was as far as they went. MotoGP itself, the ultimate stage, the prototype class, has remained closed to them. Company executives argue the brand's boutique scale can't justify the financial risk. Unlike Honda or Yamaha, MV Agusta doesn't produce millions of bikes a year. A full MotoGP program could bankrupt them. Still, for fans, the refusal hurts. MV Agusta isn't just another company. They are the mythical brand that defined motorcycle racing. To watch watch modern MotoGP without them is to watch Formula One without Ferrari. Every time an Italian anthem plays on the podium for Ducati or Aprilia, the absence of MV Agusta lingers in the background, a reminder of what once was. And that absence has turned MV Agusta into something of a ghost. Their dominance is still whispered about by old fans, their legacy still used in marketing, their names still printed on exotic bikes in showrooms. But when it comes to the modern battlefield of MotoGP, they refuse to step forward. MV Agusta's refusal isn't just about money, it's about philosophy. They've chosen to guard their history rather than risk tarnishing it. They once dominated so completely that returning and failing would be worse than not returning at all. It's the refusal of a legend, a ghost forever looking down at the sport it once owned, but no longer dares to touch. Kawasaki, its story in MotoGP is one of the most brutal withdrawals in modern racing. Unlike BMW or MV Agusta, Kawasaki didn't just stand outside the gate. They came in, fought, earned respect, and then abandoned the battlefield. And the way they did it still leaves a bitter taste. Kawasaki entered MotoGP in 2003, armed with their iconic Ninja branding and the bright green livery that fans instantly recognized. The ZX-RR wasn't the fastest bike on the grid, but Kawasaki's presence mattered. They were a Japanese powerhouse, taking the fight directly to Honda and Yamaha, adding prestige to the grid. Over the next few years, progress was slow but steady. By 2007, with riders like Randy DePugny, the team had started scoring podiums. The ZX-RR looked like it was finally evolving into a competitive machine. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis hit the motorcycle industry hard. Factories scrambled to cut costs, and in January 2009, Kawasaki announced they were pulling out of MotoGP immediately without warning. The timing was brutal. Contracts were torn apart. Engineers and mechanics were out of work overnight. Riders were left scrambling for rides with no notice. Kawasaki tried to soften the blow by allowing a one-bike satellite team, the hastily formed Hayata Racing, to run the ZX-RR for Marco Melandri. To his credit, Melandri pulled off miracles, even scoring a podium at Le Mans. But it wasn't the same. Kawasaki's name was gone. Their official refusal to continue left MotoGP poor, less diverse, and robbed fans of the chance to see the bright green Ninja battle at the front. Since then, Kawasaki has doubled down on World Superbike, where they've dominated with Jonathan Rea's 6 titles. They've built their reputation as the kings of production-based racing. But every time MotoGP is discussed, the question resurfaces: why won't Kawasaki come back? The answer is simple, but harsh. They refuse. Kawasaki has said repeatedly that MotoGP is too expensive, too political, and too detached from road bike development. Instead, they've carved out a dynasty in superbikes, where victories can be directly tied to showroom sales. It's a smart business decision. But for fans, it's a betrayal. Kawasaki proved they could play in MotoGP. They just chose to walk away, and that refusal still stings. Moto Guzzi. It is one of Italy's most historic brands, steeped in racing heritage. Back in the 1950s, they were innovators, pioneers, and winners. They built wind tunnels when nobody else thought of it. They experimented with aerodynamics and engineering tricks that were decades ahead of their time. And on track, they won. Moto Guzzi's name was etched into the foundations of the motorcycle racing. But in 1957, everything changed. A coalition of Italian manufacturers, Moto Guzzi, Galera, and Mondial, all withdrew from Grand Prix racing together, citing spiraling costs and unsustainable competition. It was the end of an era. For Moto Guzzi, it was the start of a new identity, one away from the sharp edge of racing. When the modern 4-stroke MotoGP class was born in 2002, brands like Ducati seized the chance to step up. Aprilia threw themselves into the fight. KTM eventually would too. But Moto Guzzi, they never even raised their hand. The brand famous for innovation, once a Grand Prix winner, refused to return to the premier class. Instead, Moto Guzzi reinvented themselves as a heritage and lifestyle brand. Their V7s and V9s became icons of retro cool. Their cruisers and touring bikes kept the company afloat. They leaned into their image as the Italian brand for soul, not speed. The wind tunnel stayed in their marketing brochures, but not in their engineering plans. Why did they refuse? Like MV Agusta, Moto Guzzi Guzzi simply doesn't have the resources to fight a MotoGP war. Backed by Piaggio, their niche is heritage, not horsepower. They've chosen survival and tradition over competition. But that refusal is still brutal because Moto Guzzi's DNA is racing. They were pioneers, innovators, winners, and yet, in the modern era, they've chosen to stay silent. Their history promised so much, but when the time came, they turned their back on MotoGP, leaving fans with nothing but nostalgia. Bimota. It is the kind of brand that feels like it was born in a sketchbook rather than a factory. Founded in Rimini, Italy in the 1970s, it was never about mass production. It was about art, exotic frames, radical hub-center steering, and limited-run motorcycles priced like jewelry. In the 1980s and 1990s, if you wanted a bike that nobody else on your street had, you bought a Bimota. But Bimota's DNA also screamed racing. They wanted to prove their engineering genius, not just in showrooms, but on track. The problem was scale. MotoGP requires tens of millions a year, constant development, and a full-time factory commitment. For Bimota, whose entire company output could be less than a few hundred motorcycles a year, it was like stepping into a gunfight with a pocket knife. Still, the dream flickered. In the early 1990s, they looked at the 500cc Grand Prix and wondered, could we? By the late 90s and early 2000s, they flirted openly with the idea of MotoGP. They had their Tessie project, radical bikes with hub-center steering instead of forks. They had credibility in design and a cult following. A MotoGP entry, even as an underdog, would have been a headline grabber, but reality crushed the fantasy. The funding simply wasn't there. Bimota filed for bankruptcy multiple times across its history, even while still selling street bikes. The thought of burning 50 million euros a season to be lapped by Honda and Yamaha was suicide. Investors weren't interested. Partners weren't coming forward. MotoGP was out of reach. So Bimota refused, not with a press conference or a formal statement, but with silence. Every time journalists asked if they'd try, they'd smile, shake their heads, and point to their boutique niche. Instead of going all in on MotoGP, they went all in on being different. Bikes like the Tessie 3D, and later the reborn Bimota Tessie H2, exotic, weird, expensive, kept them alive in their corner of the market. The brutality of Bimota's refusal isn't in scandal or drama, it's in what was lost. MotoGP thrives on underdogs, on stories of small companies taking wild swings at giants. Bimota could have been that story. Instead, their refusal means they'll always be remembered as the brand that dreamed too big for its own pockets. A legend in engineering circles, but a no-show on the biggest stage. Petronas GP1 few MotoGP refusals sting like Petronas. Because unlike BMW or Bimota, they actually built the bike. They had the ambition, the funding, the prototype, and then walked away before the green lights ever flashed. In the early 2000s, Petronas wanted to put Malaysia on the global racing map. They teamed up with Sauber, the Formula One outfit, and legendary rider Carl Fogarty to create a MotoGP challenger, the Petronas GP1. It was a 989 cubic centimeters triple, sleek, futuristic, and meant to debut in the brand new four-stroke MotoGP class of 2002. Foggy was lined up to run the team. Test mules were built. Photos were released. It was real. But then came the reality check. Development costs ballooned. The political landscape of MotoGP hardened. Japanese factories were entrenched. Ducati was preparing its return, and Aprilia was already struggling to stay afloat. The GP1 would have entered into a bloodbath. Petronas executives looked at the numbers and flinched. Instead of MotoGP, they pivoted the project to World Superbike. The foggy Petronas FP1 was born, based loosely on the GP1 design, but homologated for production. The bike looked incredible in turquoise livery, and in the hands of Troy Corser, it even snagged podiums. But long-term, it was outgunned. Against Ducati, Honda, and later Suzuki, the FP1 was simply too underdeveloped. Petronas pulled the plug in 2006. The MotoGP dream was over before it began. The GP1 prototypes went to museums, relics of ambition abandoned. In interviews years later, Fogarty admitted it could have been something special, but the funding and the political will weren't there. The brutality of Petronas's refusal is simple. They had the bike, they had the team, they had the name, and they still said no. It was MotoGP's great what if. A reminder that sometimes even ambition and money aren't enough to break into the premier class.